Hello Internet, welcome back to Tromsø Twilight, the channel where I, Vincent, talk to you, those who may wish to listen, about books, movies, music I enjoy, find interesting, or a combination of the two. Today we are talking about Zefyr Lisowski's book, Uncanny Valley Girls, essays on horror, survival, and love. Zefyr Lisowski is a trans and queer writer and North Carolinian living in Brooklyn, according to the blurb on the back of the book. She wrote this book around an incident where she went into psychiatric care, and she wrote about her life and what had happened prior to coming into psychiatric care and about her relationship to horror movies. One of her kind of unique approaches to writing about horror movies in the book is that she very often found that she related to or associated herself with a woman in the film presented in a kind of abject fashion. So the girl in the well in The Ring, for example, she has a really interesting essay in the book about werewolves, where she's trying to draw an analogy between werewolves and trans women, which on the face of it doesn't sound very intuitive, but in the essay it's like really interestingly carried out, and that's one of my favorites in the book. Another favorite in the book for me is the second one, which is about the movie Dark Water. Actually, it's about both versions, the Japanese and the American, and how some of the systemic critique in the Japanese film gets lost in a more sentimental American remake, although I actually personally really like the American remake. Both films are about a ghost in a building which manifests primarily through water leaking through the roof and such. And she draws an analogy between this movie and the story of a girl who drowned in her hometown, and how this story of the drowned girl exists in a way to center white people's pain and tragedy at the expense of indigenous people, for example, or Black Americans whose entire towns in some cases have been drowned in order to make the bodies of water that these white women later have drowned in. It's a really sophisticated and interesting analysis both of the film and of this phenomena. It's followed, however, with a less successful attempt at something similar. She writes an essay about the film Scream called Ghostface, and this is a really great idea, that Ghostface also being like a name for a white person is an opportunity for her to kind of critique the whiteness of film, American white supremacy, the whiteness of the suburbs and the movie itself, and how she envisaged the west coast of America through the lens of films like Scream. It's great conceptually, but she doesn't really pull it off. And this made me think a lot about how white Americans are kind of in this conundrum often, where they have to say something about the fundamental racism of America, otherwise they're complicit, but they're not necessarily always the best placed to actually make that analysis. And this is really my experience of Uncanny Valley Girls, that she swings from absolute brilliance to other essays that are less successful and somewhat annoying. The second section of the book is the best in my opinion. It has three amazing essays in it. The first one, War on Terror, is about the confluence of sadistic horror films of the 2000s like Saw, Hostel, and that type of material, which is material that she explains that she never really liked, and that I also have never really enjoyed, even though I like horror as a genre. And she ties this into the War on Terror and all the torture that was being carried out by American servicemen and Blackwater and such abroad, and also tells the story of a boy that she had a kind of love relationship and friendship with, who was very interested in these films, and how he ultimately rejected her as internalized homophobia and anti-queerness kind of seeped into their relationship. But what makes this even more interesting is that she has just reached a point in her life where she's also able to see that she was not able to really allow him to come close, and that she also pushed him away, and she's not totally sure what the dynamic of the parting ways really was. The next two essays in that section are equally excellent. One is called Southern Fried. That is about how, in viewing Texas Chainsaw Massacre, she was able to see the South, where she grew up, through a different lens, that the film helped her to see the beauty of the landscape that she lived within. And Cutting in Miniature, which is about her self-harm and also about the death of her father, and about how she both wrote poems about Lizzie Borden in the aftermath of his death, and also how she began to make miniatures of the crime scene in Lizzie Borden's house, tried to make a dollhouse, and all of this was her way of processing her grief. Now, to me, the book kind of starts to fall apart in the last section, although it does have the chapter about werewolves that I thought was pretty good. She starts to lose the focus on horror films and go deeper and deeper into her autobiographical material. So she writes one essay about devotion, which is about how her sister died before she was born, and about the influence of her sister on her life, which is also nominally about the film Saint Maud. And she writes what I think is the weakest essay, Crazy in Love, which I'll come back to in a second because I have very much a critique of that chapter. But before I do that, I just want to wind all the way back to where I think she's at her strongest is actually when she really writes about how she relates to horror films. And I'll give an example of this. She has a critique of Black Swan because her ex-partner, Vespertine, was a huge fan of the film Black Swan, and Zefyr Lisowski has always had a problem with the film, and she finally realizes after they break up what the issue with Black Swan and with Darren Aronofsky's films actually is. She writes, "Let me talk about hate, love's cousin. Darren Aronofsky, Black Swan's director, seems to hate the abject and anyone else who death touches. In his most widely acclaimed films, i.e. Requiem for a Dream, The Whale, and Black Swan, he picks apart a different group and shows them living in misery, drug users, fat people, mentally ill women. He refuses to consider them capable of being survivors or holding a complex interiority beyond their own pathologies. He refuses to think of them, it seems, as wholly alive. Indeed, one of the main flaws of Black Swan is its inability to consider Nina as a full person, never having a moment of lucidity outside her delusions. When she sees things that aren't there, the movie, lazy and cruel, assumes she'll never know the truth. Intoxicated with her own hysteria, Nina stumbles between emotions with no space for reflection in between. The movie is drunk with hate, refusing to let in anything outside its own worldview. It refuses Nina the category of the human, and because of that, she dies." So I really loved this, and it's early in the book. It really endeared me to Zefyr Lisowski, but I think that she loses some of that insight when she begins to talk about her own life later in the book. Okay, so to me, one of the weaknesses with this book is that rather than taking each film and working through her associations and ideas about the film, she is trying to work through and understand certain experiences from her own life. So she comes back again and again to the same experiences, for example, of sexual assault while she was at university, a very traumatic relationship or friendship, an abusive relationship that she had with a boy of her own age when she was young, her relationship to her father. But she's coming to what appears to be the catalyst for this collection, which is some time that she spent in inpatient care. And she's admitted to inpatient care when a relationship she has with Vespertine reaches a point that's just untenable. So Vespertine is another trans woman who is very unpredictable and unreliable, doesn't answer messages over long periods of time, is very hot and cold, and also is serially unfaithful. Lisowski appears to be very unable to deal with this type of behaviour. This continual hot and cold appearance and disappearance, ghosting on her, means that her self-harm increases exponentially till she's cutting all the time. And at a certain point, she realises that she needs to break up with this person and seek help. And her mother helps her to research local psychiatric units that will take her insurance, and they find the one that they consider to be the least carceral, the least like a prison. and she spends 10 days there. And it seems that Lisowski has had like lots of different diagnoses. It appears that she got a personality disorder diagnosis while she was in inpatient care. It seems that she's also diagnosed with autism. It seems that somebody else has previously thought that she had ADHD, though she maybe didn't give that person enough information about her to really make a good assessment. And she also talks a lot about PTSD. There's loads of diagnoses through the book. And she says of Vespertine, we shared diagnoses, but beyond that, we barely knew each other. There's something about the way that she writes about her own psychiatric issues that I find very uncomfortable. And I'm going to try to be as respectful and polite as I can be. But she says, for example, before my admittance, I had already started researching the microcanon of women like me, those who had spiritual and emotional breakdowns because of white supremacy, capitalism, and their relationships. But I noticed that none of these women were dating other crazy women, or at least they didn't frame it that way. They were abused, and the other party was rightly the abuser, or they dated men who wielded power over them in other ways. And she talks about, F. Scott Fitzgerald's wife. And later, when she talks about the people who are in the psych ward with her, she says, I hated that psych ward, but I also found myself there. No, I hated the staff and the shape of the place, its long, narrow hallway I walked down again and again. The other people confined there, I loved. Confined, that other people confined there. And confined is a word that we use when a person has been admitted against their will, whilst Lisowski has requested inpatient care, stayed there for 10 days, and then left. It troubles me as someone who works in psychiatry that she presents this event in her life as a new kind of abuse visited upon her, that she's been confined, that she's one of a series of women who have collapsed under white supremacy and capitalism, when she has sought help because she was unable to manage what was happening in her relationship with her partner. And it troubles me that this essay is about Antichrist, and she frames it as being about crazy women, and she self-identifies as a crazy woman. She's allowed to identify any way that she likes, but I found myself kind of becoming like trapped in a rhetoric that was defined by pain, and I kind of reject it. It's interesting to me because when it comes to Greer Langton, the artist, which Lisowski writes about at the end of the book, she has the same reaction. Greer Langton's art, her making of dolls, is often read in relation to her biography and her illness and her difficulties psychiatrically. And Lisowski wants to reject at least partially that reading of Greer Langton's art, and yet she visits the same type of reading upon herself and her life. This is troubling to me for a variety of reasons, not least that people seek out psychiatric care for a variety of reasons throughout their life. These reasons are usually highly complex. In the book, it seems to be that this short stay in voluntary psychiatric inpatient care is sort of evidence of something, that it's almost like a defining moment in her narrative. And I don't think this is especially healthy or constructive. I don't think that having stayed at a psychiatric unit is a very useful thing to structure your identity around. And I don't think that the category of crazy is really any less oppressive than the various psychiatric diagnoses that the American Psychiatric Association force upon the Western world. Like, there's almost an idea that if you get the right combination of psychiatric diagnoses, then you've said something essential or important or meaningful about yourself and your identity. And I think that actually this is something that we ought to resist. I also think that self-defining as crazy is not necessarily any more useful. You might say, well, of course you find it troubling, Vincent, because you're a psychologist and she's a patient and you're just replicating the same power dynamics. And in order for me to argue against that, I would have to tell you things about my family and my own life that frankly are none of your business. And that is why I find this whole kind of trend of like laying out all of your diagnoses and your traumatic experiences as the kind of building blocks for your artistic identity as being like somewhat worrying. But I also think that Lisowski's quite young and she's extremely intelligent and she writes very, very well. And I think that she's written this book like with only a small remove from the experiences she's describing. So we see her kind of working through it. So what I will say, I think, to summarize, is that Lisowski is extremely interesting, fascinating as a writer, but not for the reasons that she maybe considers herself interesting. Like, I'm less interested in some of the details of her traumatic experiences than I am in the way that she transforms a lot of her experience into art, like the way that she, when she was first subjected to these sexual assaults, researched and wrote a series of poems about wolves. And when her dad died, that she wrote a book about Lizzie Borden and started to make miniatures. I find all of this fascinating. I find her ability to read films from an angle that you would have not seen them read before to be also super fascinating. And I really want to read more of her work, even though this book was kind of a mixed bag for me. Okay, I don't know how coherent that was. I didn't plan it properly. I've just been thinking about it for a couple of days since I finished reading the book. I hope you got something out of my discussion of this book. If you've read it, let me know. If you want to talk to me about any of the things that I've mentioned, jump in the comments. And I'll be back soon to talk about either some music or another book or perhaps a movie. See you soon.